Tonight we are delighted that Dr. Matthew O'Kelly is our speaker. He's based in Cape Town with his family. He's on the staff of George Whitefield College, which is a very distinguished position because that was my early academic position. I too was on the staff of George Whitefield College in its very early days, a long time ago. And Matt recently completed his PhD on social memory and Proverbs. And great news is that it's been accepted for publication now in the Vetus Testamentum supplement series. And he's continuing to write extensively in this area. The doctorate was on social memory and Proverbs, and he's going to speak to us tonight on the Decalogue and Proverbs. Okay, Matt, over to you.
Amen. Thank you, Craig. It's difficult to overstate the significance of the Decalogue within the moral instruction of the Old Testament. It's given pride of place at the head of God's instruction to Israel after bringing them up out of Egypt, giving them a first indication of what should characterize the relationship between God and God's people as his covenant people. It's also the only instruction that God gives the Israelites directly. Following the theophany at Sinai or Horeb, the Israelites, out of fear of their encounter with the divine, request that God not do that again. Speak to Moses, and they'll listen, they say. Another such encounter with God, and they don't expect they'll live to tell the tale. Now, we'll come back to the giving of the Decalogue to the Israelites shortly, but the Decalogue's importance doesn't end there. Its contents are elaborated on in places throughout the Pentateuch. It underlies the castigations and the indictments of the prophets. It resonates through many of the Psalms. And, the focus of this lecture, it intersects with and underpins much of the instruction of the book of Proverbs. In a nutshell, what I aim to show this evening is twofold, or fill in the blank for whatever time zone you're in. Firstly, that the Decalogue underpins Proverbs' moral instruction, though how it does so at different points in the book will require some explanation and nuance. And secondly, that this offers a window into how the Decalogue itself should be understood and applied. In other words, an investigation is both the Decalogue in wisdom and wisdom in the Decalogue. To do this, we'll spend some time looking first at the Decalogue within the instructional framework of Deuteronomy, and then we'll turn to how this instructional framework, with the Decalogue at its core, finds its way into the book of Proverbs. And then I'll wrap up with some thoughts and implications on the intersection of wisdom and decalogic instruction. So looking first then at the Decalogue in Deuteronomy's instruction. In the book of Deuteronomy, the Decalogue finds its place within the narrative world of Moses addressing the Israelites on the plains of Moab, on the brink of entering the Promised Land. Place where it is the Decalogue straddles the line between the relaying of God's commands for the instruction of the present generation of Israelites in the story world of the text, and the recounting of the story of God's appearance to the people at Sinai, or Horeb, as Deuteronomy prefers to call it, alongside the wilderness wanderings of the previous generation, who showed themselves incapable of listening to God's commands. In the way the narrative unfolds in Deuteronomy, by the time we reach the giving of the Decalogue, Moses has already recounted some of the happenings of the wilderness wanderings, setting the backdrop for how Moses will introduce the Decalogue in the first few verses of chapter 5, where the present generation is established as the addressees of Moses' instruction, not the previous generation, who through their unfaithfulness forfeited their covenant inheritance. When we place the events recounted in the book along the timeline, though, God's appearance at Horeb and the giving of the 10 words marks the earliest event along the timeline. Chapter 1 picks up from when the Israelites were leaving Horeb. Chapter 5 retells what happened at Horeb. As such, while it might not mark the book's opening lines, there is nevertheless a certain fundamentality about chapter 5 and the giving of the Decalogue for what the book hopes to communicate, standing at a key moment in the identity formation of the people and at the head of God's instruction to the Israelites for the determination of the shape that the covenant is supposed to take. Deuteronomy 5 can be broken up into three major sections. We've got the opening narrative in verses 1 to 5. We've got the Decalogue itself in verses 6 to 21. after which the narrative resumes again in verses 22 to 33. Starting at verse 1, uh, Moses called together all of Israel and said to them, "Listen, Israel, to the decrees and judgments that I am speaking in your hearing today. Learn them and carefully obey them." Here already, some significant points are worth picking up. To begin with, Moses calls attention to Moses calls the Israelites to listen to and pay attention to the decrees and the judgments. This is variously translated by interpreters. You will have heard a slight variation on this when Craig read from Deuteronomy earlier. The phrase is "hachukim ve'amishpatim." We're going to go with decrees and judgments for this evening. It's worth asking the question, just what are these decrees and judgments? One might be inclined to think that it refers to the Decalogue itself, set out just a few verses later in verses 6 to 21. But this, I think, would be premature. In a narrow sense, the decrees and the judgments are only taken up in the so-called legal core of the book in chapters 12 to 26. There's a shift that takes place between chapters 4 to 11 and its constant insistence that the Israelites listen to, learn, carefully obey the decrees and judgments, and chapters 12 to 26, which turn to spelling out what these decrees and judgments actually entail in the details. Some warrant actually for taking the decrees and judgments in this narrower sense can be found in chapter 5 as well. After calling attention to the decrees and judgments in verse 1, as that which Moses is speaking in your hearing today, attention is turned in verse 4 to a recollection of what God said to the people at Horeb, namely the 10 words, which are recounted in the very next part of the chapter. When the decrees and the judgments are then mentioned again in verse 31, they're used quite deliberately not to refer to the 10 words, which God spoke to all the people, but to the instruction that God imparts to Moses, in keeping with the arrangement that we saw earlier, that Moses would be the one to then teach them to the Israelites. From verse 32, Moses then snaps back to the present moment within the story world of the text, calling the present generation of Israelites to carefully obey, just as God commanded them, preparing the way for the command in 6 verse 1, hamitzvah, a singular noun, but which is placed in apposition to and can be taken to encapsulate the essence of the decrees and the judgments. Now, there's been some debate as to what the command here refers to as a singular noun, but in my view, the strongest candidate is that it points forward to the Shema in verses 4 and 5 in that same chapter. Listen, Israel, hearkening back to the earlier call to listen back in 5 verse 1. Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your capacity. Words that are expected to plaster everywhere, bound to their bodies, written on their surroundings, always on their minds, whether they're awake or asleep, at home or on the move, pervading every conversation as parents instruct their children to fear the Lord and to keep God's commands. So where does the Decalogue fit into all this? Well, Philip Jensen, I think quite plausibly, sees the Decalogue within this schema as the middle segment of an instructional pyramid between the Shema and the decrees and the judgments. The Decalogue is both summed up in the Shema, which offers a sort of positive statement of the negative first command, have no other gods before me, the outworking of which is played out through the rest of the 10, and it's elaborated on, the 10 commandments are elaborated on in the so-called legal core of the book in chapters 12 through 26, which set out the decrees and judgments proper, reflecting the same fundamental concerns presented in the Decalogue. In Eugene Merrill's words, the Shema is to the Decalogue what the Decalogue is to the full corpus of covenant stipulations. The same movement in abbreviated fashion can also be seen in Deuteronomy 4. The chapter opens in verse 1 with the injunction anticipating the similar call in 5 verse 1 to listen to the decrees and the judgments, along with expectation in 4 verse 9, anticipating a similar directive in chapter 6, that the people will teach them to their children and their grandchildren. There's this pattern of familial instruction that pervades the section of Deuteronomy and is here in chapter 4. Here too, Moses' instruction is set against the backdrop of the Israelites' encounter with God at Horeb and the giving of the 10 words. We see this in verses 10 to 13. As we saw in chapter 5, the 10 words are spoken directly to the people in general, but here also written on 2 stone tablets, alongside the decrees and the judgments spoken to Moses in particular, who is tasked with teaching the people, a task Moses is taking up in the story's present moment in 4 verse 1. Listen to the decrees and the judgments, which I am teaching you to do. For all its similarities, though, several features of Deuteronomy set the chapter apart. Most significantly for our purposes, verses 1 to 8 bring attentiveness to God's instruction into the realm of discourse on the meaning and application of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible. The people are called to listen to the decrees and judgments that Moses is teaching them because, verse 6, doing so will stand testament to your wisdom and your insight in the eyes of the peoples, who will hear about these decrees and judgments and say, what a wise and discerning people this great nation is. In other words, as far as Deuteronomy is concerned, this is what wisdom looks like. Attentiveness to God's commands, shown forth in a life of obedience. This is the essence of Deuteronomic instruction, summed up in the Shema, as Israel are called to love the Lord their God with their all, spelled out in the decrees and the judgments, detailing how God's commands are to structure Israelite worship and society, and, most significantly for our purposes, given supreme summative expression in the Decalogue. With all this in place, we're in a position to consider how the Decalogue shapes the instruction of the book of Proverbs. Links between at least parts of Proverbs and the instructional paradigm, Proverbs' instructional paradigm in Deuteronomy are well known, particularly in the book's frame in chapters 1 to 9 and 30 and 31. Calls in Proverbs 3, 6, and 7 to bind and write commands and Torah upon oneself, in front of one's eyes, upon one's heart. All this is strongly suggestive of the calls in Deuteronomy 6 and elsewhere to do likewise. Agag's warning in Proverbs 30, verse 6, not to add to God's words, lest you be rebuked and shown up as a liar, calls to mind similar warning in Deuteronomy 4, 2 and 13, 1, neither to add to nor to take away from God's commands. We'll come back to the body of Proverbs just now, which presents something of a different case. But for the moment, it's significant that the book is topped and tailed with appeals for attentiveness to divine instruction, particularly as it's given expression in Deuteronomy. Cast within this framework, Proverbs' theological and moral instruction is given a particular slant, grounded in attentiveness to Torah and oriented towards the fear of the Lord. Given this, and given what we've seen just a moment ago of the significance of the Decalogue within the instructional framework of Deuteronomy, it'll come as no surprise to find that the Decalogue itself also permeates Proverbs instruction. In what follows, we'll look first at how this works out in the frame, in Proverbs 1 to 9, and particularly in Proverbs 30, which we'll see as something of a hotspot for Decalogue references. And then we'll turn to the body in chapters 10 to 29. So looking first at Proverbs 1 to 9, the most overt references to the Decalogue are found in the warnings against the foreign woman in 6:20 to 35. After being enjoined to guard and not forsake the commands and teaching or the Torah of his parents, the son is warned not to be taken with the beauty and seduction of a foreigner. That doing so would mark a contravention of Torah in general, and inversely, that doing so would be prevented by attentiveness to Torah, is strongly underscored by the presentation of such an escapade in direct contravention of the Decalogue in particular. In keeping with the 10th command, the son is told in verse 25, don't desire her beauty, or we could say, don't covet her beauty in your heart. In keeping with the 7th, he's warned in verse 32 that a man who commits adultery with a woman lacks sense. And in keeping with the 8th, or at least calling to mind the 8th, doing so is compared in verses 30 and 31 with the transgressions of a thief. Beyond these more overt references, though, it is possible to push further and to see the value system of the Decalogue at play more broadly within the world of Proverbs 1 to 9's moral instruction and the wisdom that it seeks to instill in its readers. Concerns around sexual fidelity across the lectures about the foreign woman in chapters 5 to 7, though I would argue that this isn't the primary argument of these chapters, again are reflective of the seventh command, even if the word for adultery isn't specifically mentioned. Warnings against sinners and wicked men in Proverbs 1, 10 to 19 and 4, 14 to 19, and the murderous heists that they pursue reflect commands 6 and 8 against murder and theft. And God's detestation of a lying witness in 6:19, and perhaps more loosely the admonitions in 3:29 to 30, not to plot evil against one's neighbor or to take them to court for no reason, reflect the ninth command against false testimony. Even more broadly, underpinning the tone of the instruction of Proverbs 1 to 9 as a whole is the fifth command. Honor your father and mother, just as the Lord your God commanded you. A command that comes somewhat uniquely among the 10 with a motivation, so that your days will be prolonged, and so that it'll go well for you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. The relationship between these two components of the command itself and its motivation isn't always explained by commentators, and when it is, it isn't always made particularly clear how they're meant to relate. Perhaps, as Patrick Miller suggests, honoring one's parents in their old age, since he assumes, along with many others, that it's primarily adult children who are being addressed in this command. That honoring one's parents in their old age will, in effect, establish a culture of a caring society, that all members are cared for, leading with a certain degree of inevitability to a flourishing society. But while I don't really have any major qualms with this reading, nor can I say that I'm altogether convinced that it covers the full purview of the command. While it certainly includes adult children's concern for their elderly parents, it certainly wouldn't have been limited to such. No age range is clearly mentioned or implied. The command, rather, is given to instill a disposition of respect within and for the sake of the proper functioning of the household through all stages of life, from youth to young age, from youth to old age. This being the case, a strong explanation for the link between the command and the motivation, in my view, and one more consistent with the instructional setting of Deuteronomy, particularly in this part of the book, is that given the responsibility of parents to instruct their children in the ways of the Lord, including in the very next section in Deuteronomy 6, 1 to 9, honoring one's parents will amount to, at least in part, listening to and internalizing their instruction as they are tasked with teaching their children to walk in the fear of the Lord. And as they do so, they will reap the benefits of covenant obedience, frequently expressed in terms of prolonged days in the land, again, notably in the next section in 6, 1 to 9. The same dynamic can be seen in Proverbs 1 to 9, most prominently in chapter 2, which functions as a sort of summary argument for the collection as a whole. The father addresses his son in the first place, outlining the disposition of wisdom and the instruction in verses 1 to 11. If you accept my commands, verses 1 to 4, then you will understand the fear of the Lord, verses 5 to 8. And then you will understand righteousness, justice, and fairness, verses 9 to 11, which in verses 12 through 22 gives way to the outworking of wisdom and instruction. This is so as to protect you from evil men in verses 12 to 15 and a foreign woman in verses 16 to 19. And all of this, the disposition leading to the outworking of wisdom and instruction, all this is in verses 20 to 22, so that you will walk in the way of the good, and paths of righteousness you will keep, for the upright will live in the land, and those with integrity will remain in it, while the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the unfaithful uprooted from it. Similar sentiments can be found in Proverbs 3 as well. My son, don't forget my teaching, and let your heart keep my commands, for prolonged days and years of life and peace will abound for you. This dovetails also with what we saw earlier, that Proverbs 3:1 marks one of the three places in Proverbs 1 to 9 to most clearly point to the passage enclosing the Shema in Deuteronomy 6, which, while encapsulating all the decrees and the judgments, also points in a special way to the first two commands, or at least the first command of the Decalogue, calling for exclusive worship of God. It's with this orientation rooted in God's instruction, given core summative expression in the Decalogue, that wisdom in Proverbs 1 to 9 takes shape. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge the Lord, and the Lord will straighten your paths. Don't be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. This posture of humble attentiveness to God's instruction, resulting in a posture of obedience to God's commands, is also what Agur sees in Proverbs 30, which is what we turn to next. The Decalogue has a significant role to play on this opposite end of the book, most prominently in Agur's words, less so in Lemuel's words in Proverbs 31. So we've left that aside for this evening. Again, fill in the time zone based on where you are. It should be said at the outset that this is, without question, one of the most difficult chapters in the book of Proverbs. Some have suggested even perhaps within the whole of the Hebrew Bible. Of the numerous challenges that this chapter presents, I'll be venturing into hardly any of them. But there is one question at the outset that I think would be worth some of our time, particularly as we prepare to see how the Decalogue features in the rest of Agur's words. Particularly in the first part of the chapter, many of the same ideas that are given prominence in Proverbs 1 to 9 are once again placed front and center. We've got wisdom and insight leading to knowledge of the Holy One. We've got the pivotal importance of the Word of God, described as a shield for the one who takes refuge in it. And yet, confusingly, all this is to say that this is not something that Agur has attained. I am more of an animal than a man, and I don't possess the insight of a human. I haven't learned wisdom, nor knowledge of the Holy One do I comprehend. Now, it's doubtful that Agur's words here should be taken with full seriousness. As Alex Kirk has shown, comparisons with Psalm 73, Isaiah 40, and God's whirlwind speech with Job point to the fact that what Agur is expressing here is not so much a failure as much as a stance of pronounced humility before the God who has ordered the cosmos. What Michael Fox has to say of Job could be taken to apply in Agur's case as well. The limitation of Job's or Agur's wisdom is not the main point. The main point is that man can see quite clearly if he only broadens his perspective. God's wisdom and power in creating and ruling the cosmos. A corollary of this for Agur is that to have one's perspective appropriately broadened requires sitting under God's instruction. So verses 5 and 6, every word of God is refined. It is a shield to those who take refuge in it. Don't add to God's words, lest God chastises you and shows you up to be a liar. It's against this epistemological backdrop of knowledge attained through attentiveness to God's word that Agur's moral instruction proceeds. Instruction that, not unfittingly, is pervaded with the language and instruction of the Decalogue. In his prayer in verses 7 to 9, the third, eighth, and ninth command are all called to mind, and implicitly also the 10th, in Agur's request that deceit and lying speech be kept from him, and that he only be provided with what he needs, neither too much, that he deny God, nor too little, that he resort to theft, and so dishonor God's name. In the following segment, in verses 11 to 14, the fifth command is called to mind in Agur's castigation of a generation who curses its father and doesn't bless its mother, marking a departure from the ideals of Torah, not simply through a violation of one of its commands, but in line with what we saw a moment ago in Proverbs 1 to 9, a rejection of Torah itself by severing oneself from the familial wellspring of Torah's instruction. The idea is then returned to in verse 17 in a moment of poetic justice, where an eye who mocks its father and despises obedience to the mother who bore it, a crow of the wadi will peck it out, and a vulture's offspring will consume it. A little further on, the seventh commandment is brought to the fore once more, tagged onto the end of Agag's list of things that he finds perplexing. While the ways of an eagle in the sky, a snake on the rock, a ship in the sea, or a man with a young woman leave no trace behind them, there can be no question about the moral evaluation of the way of an adulteress, who wipes away the evidence of her transgression as one would the food off one's mouth after a meal. Putting all this together, what we see in Proverbs 30 is that, at least as far as Agur is concerned, proper perception of how the world is ordered and any hope of attaining wisdom comes from a posture of humble attentiveness to the God who sees to its ongoing existence. As this is meted out in Agur's moral reflections, though, it becomes clear that at the heart of such instruction is the Decalogue. Top and tail, this is the paradigm that Proverbs seeks to instill in its readership. Turning then to the body of Proverbs, as I mentioned earlier, the sayings that make up much of the book's body present something of a different case. In marked contrast with the introduction and the conclusion in chapters 1 to 9 and 30 and 31, where the covenant framework and the instruction of Torah are placed front and center, the Proverbs for which the book is best known don't obviously, or at least don't consistently, depend on or draw from the legal material in the Pentateuch. Certainly not in the sense that they can be said to appeal to or build on it as their primary grounding of their authority. And the commands of the Decalogue, while not absent altogether, they don't feature nearly as clearly as what we saw in the introduction or in the words of Agur. Where Deuteronomy is clearly paralleled in the body of Proverbs, it's primarily from the section of the decrees and the judgments in Deuteronomy 12 to 26. Warnings about moving established boundary stones, or uneven weights, or the taking of bribes, or drunkenness and insubordination, and so forth. In some cases, this is probably because some of what we find in Deuteronomy has its origins in the proverbial material that we have preserved in Proverbs 10 to 29. It isn't difficult to see how this might have been the case, given the nature of Proverbs as time-honored sayings that, owing to their pedigree, are afforded a certain authority to speak to the world, to how the world works with a sense of obviousness. It stands to reason that, over time, certain sayings about how things are done would be consolidated in legal instruction to express how things must be done. In such cases, traditional wisdom given expression in the Proverbs is engrafted into the covenantal instruction of a book like Deuteronomy. This is probably what Joseph Blenkinsop had in mind when he said that, particularly in a society like that of early Israel, law may be described as a specialization of tribal wisdom in a sense. But while this might explain some cases, it doesn't explain them all. It's probable that at different points in different proverb collections, the relationship should be understood quite differently and taken on a case-by-case basis. In any event, however we answer the diachronic question, and however we're inclined to sort out the timeline regarding the book's composition, it's unlikely to impinge on how the Proverbs were understood by their early readership, at least by the time that the book's various collections were brought together in the Persian period to form the Book of Proverbs as we more or less as we know it now. Read from this perspective, many of the distinctions dissolve. Couched within the instructional framework of Proverbs 1 to 9 and 30 and 31, the Proverbs serve to underscore and to fill out the instruction of Torah, including the Decalogue, spelling out its implications across all areas of life, from the obviously legal right through to the mundane and seemingly inconsequential. This, it's perhaps worth noting, is not unlike what we saw of the decrees and the judgments earlier in Deuteronomy 12 to 26, which within the instruction of Deuteronomy serve to elaborate on the Decalogue. This being the case, it's striking that most of the clearest parallels between Proverbs 10 to 29 and Deuteronomy come from Deuteronomy 12 to 26. Things like the examples I mentioned earlier, moving boundary stones, uneven weights, taking bribes, and so forth. Brought into this schema, connections between the sayings in Proverbs 10 to 29 and the Decalogue begin to snap into focus, even if, again, the parallels aren't quite as direct as what we've become used to seeing from elsewhere in the book. As elsewhere, the fifth command to honor one's father and mother is commonplace. A wise son makes his father happy, but a foolish person despises their mother. Vexation belongs to the father of a foolish son, and bitterness to the one who gave him birth. Doing violence to their father and chasing off their mother is a son who brings shame and disgrace. The eighth command, do not steal, is explicitly called to mind only once. Proverbs 29:24, someone who shares with a thief hates their own life. But it is often implied throughout the Proverbs in its denunciations of using false weights, extortion, and the moving of boundary stones. Fraudulent scales are an abomination to Yahweh, but honest weights are in Yahweh's favor. Trouble comes to the house of the one chasing extortion, but someone who detests bribes will live. Don't remove a permanent boundary marker, and don't encroach on the fields of the fatherless. The ninth command, don't give false testimony, appears frequently throughout the Proverbs. A righteous witness declares the truth, but a witness full of lies is deceitful. A trustworthy witness doesn't lie, but a lying witness testifies falsely. A witness full of lies will perish, but someone who listens will speak winsomely. Don't be a gratuitous witness. And would you seek to entice with your lips? And the 10th command, do not covet, while not explicitly referred to, can nevertheless be seen to underlie much of Proverbs' instruction when we broaden our perspective to see, as Craig Bartholomew has shown, that what the command points to is not simply covetousness taken in a narrow sense, but the fundamental pattern of desire leading to acts, which in fact pervades all the other commands as well. For instance, do not steal stems from a desire for wealth and profit and property that isn't one's own. Desires that are reframed through proverbial observations, such as wealth dissipates quicker than mist, while someone who gathers by their own hand will see abundance, and better a little with righteousness than a great income with injustice. So where then does all this leave us? Well, in my view, at least two main implications follow from what we've seen of the Decalogue in the book of Proverbs. The first is that it underscores the deeply covenantal nature of Proverbs instruction. Proverbs cannot be relegated to the sidelines of the Hebrew Bible as mere wisdom literature, uninterested in the particulars of Israel, the memory of Sinai, or the covenant there established. Given what we've seen of the Decalogue's central summative place in Deuteronomy's covenantal instruction, it stands to reason that by appealing to the Decalogue's commands, the book of Proverbs aims to instill in its readers the same underlying disposition of covenant allegiance, for God's people to love the Lord their God alone, with all their heart, with all their soul, and with all their capacity. Put differently, the Decalogue's pervasion within Proverbs' moral vision underscores Proverbs' primary agenda that the reader would, to borrow from the ending of Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep God's commands. This is no less the case in the body of Proverbs in chapters 10 to 29, which, while less inclined to overtly allude to the Decalogue, nevertheless operates within the same ethical framework, grafted in as the proverb collections of chapters 10 to 29 were brought into the frame of the later composed and more overtly covenant-centered introduction and conclusion in chapters 1 to 9 and 30 and 31. From this point of view, the Proverbs take up the instruction of the frame and spell it out in the details of everyday life. What does it look like to honor your father and mother? What does it look like to avoid the vices of theft, false witness, or covetousness? It's within this ethical framework that wisdom takes shape in the book of Proverbs. Though never equated with instruction, wisdom is nevertheless consistently portrayed as being closely aligned with it and closely related to it. Stuart Weeks explains that wisdom in the ancient world went hand in hand with instruction. To become wise, he writes, one had to learn the right things. And to learn the right things properly was to become wise. This being the case, it stands to reason that as far as Proverbs was concerned, wisdom lies to a significant degree in the ability and the moral wherewithal to heed the commands of the Decalogue. This leads right into the second implication. If on the one hand we see the Decalogue in Proverbs' instruction of wisdom, It's also possible to see, on the other hand, the inherence of wisdom in the Decalogue. This can be seen in part in Deuteronomy's own assessment that, like we saw earlier, this will be your wisdom and your insight in the eyes of the peoples who will hear of all these decrees and will say, what a wise and discerning people this great nation is. Within Deuteronomy, these decrees and judgments that invite such an assessment from the nations, it should be remembered, don't themselves refer to the Decalogue, but to elaborations on the Decalogue through the legal core of the book in chapters 12 through 26, as the principles of the Decalogue are spelled out through various spheres and circumstances of everyday Israelite life. But elaborations of this sort aren't limited to Deuteronomy. As you've seen, this is what Proverbs is doing as well, beginning with the instruction and the authority of the Decalogue, but then going on to explore its implications and applications in everyday life. In doing so, Proverbs provides a window into how the Decalogue was intended to function, as a summary of God's instruction for the covenant people, but one that invites reflection to see to its proper application in a complex world where God's people will be confronted with less than straightforward situations that require wisdom to parse out and map their course in the pursuit of righteousness and covenant faithfulness. Thank you for your attention.
My question is, what would you see as the relationship between the promise of life in Deuteronomy and the repetition in the Proverbs that if you live wisely, you'll have life. If you don't, you'll have death. Is there a relationship there between those two?
I think there very much is, and I think particularly evident in places like Proverbs 1 to 9. I think what we've got is an appropriation of Deuteronomy's theology, Deuteronomy's worldview, and taking that on board to say um, this was all spelled out in Deuteronomy, but this is how we structure our lives
Uh,
as a whole. There's a fronting of the covenant and the sorts of expectations that they would all the sorts of things that they would expect to come from it. Um, Life in abundance, rain in the right seasons, as was promised in Deuteronomy. I think it's fully just taking on that picture and saying, here you go,
uh,
and bringing wisdom much more into the fold and spelling out the place of wisdom within that covenantal system than Deuteronomy does.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Okay, Nathan, I think you have a question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. One clarification question, I suppose. When in chapter 28, verses 7 and 9, the language of Torah is used. I assume, perhaps unfairly, I assume that you think that refers perhaps to the Deuteronomic Torah, the law, or as with others, do you think it was referring to parental instruction or something like that? Yeah, that's my question, really.
Yes, yeah. I do think that is quite explicitly calling Torah to mind, much the same as Proverbs 1 to 9 is. Um, Interestingly enough, I forget which verse it was specifically in Proverbs 28. It was one of the ones that you mentioned. Um, but Michael Fishbane sort of did a bit of a flip-flop on this. In his earlier work, he underscored the connections between particularly Proverbs 1 to 9, but Proverbs and Deuteronomy um, quite strongly, and then backed away in some of his later work and put in a footnote, yeah, I'm not really sure that there's any overt connection between Deuteronomy and Proverbs. Probably the only one is Proverbs 28. And I
Mm,
find that really interesting because like the parallels in Proverbs 1 to 9 are very strong.
yeah.
Um, but yes, I mean, he even somebody who'd kind of found a newfound skepticism for the relationship between Proverbs and Deuteronomy would still want to acknowledge that here in chapter 28 we've got somewhat overt references to Torah. I think that is what's going on in here in chapter 28,
Yeah.
even if that's not uniformly what's going on across the Proverbs in their earliest forms.
Thank you. Yeah, I noticed that Michael Fox also says it's not the law, it's not the Torah, but verse 9 might be. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay,
absolutely.
Nathan, before you go, can you just tell us where you're joining us from?
Yes, well, I'm in Lancaster. I'm a PhD candidate with Jamie Grant at HTC.
Oh my goodness. Okay, and Jamie is with us as well.
Jamie's with us as well. Looking
That's
forward.
Pray for him, brethren, pray for him.
We'll pray for both of you, I think, at the end. Okay, Rachel, could you also tell us? Great to have you with us. Tell us where you're from and what you're doing, and then please ask your question.
Yes, yeah. I'm currently in Seattle, Washington,
Oh,
and I just completed a PhD through Trinity College Dublin, and I'll be adjuncting at Western Washington University starting in the fall, focused in religious studies over there. And my question is, if I wrote this down correctly, one of the implications that you were talking about with the connections between Proverbs and Deuteronomy was kind of the covenant nature that's brought into Proverbs. And I'm wondering, especially with scholarship that sees the instruction of Amenemobi in chapters 22 and 23, how kind of the absorption of Egyptian wisdom in those chapters would sort of dialogue with the covenant nature of Proverbs that you're suggesting.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. First of all, congrats on the PhD. As a newly minted PhD myself, I'm still also reveling in the excitement. So I share your joy. Well done.
I'm taking a rest too.
Well deserved.
Yeah,
Yes.
Matt is not resting, so let me tell you.
I have two small kids, okay? The question of parallels with Amenemope, I think there are at least three things that come to mind for me. The first is just to kind of touch back on a point that I made in the lecture about how different parts of Proverbs I think should be assessed differently in its relationship with Deuteronomy, and that will perhaps come back when I get to my third point. But I'd probably be inclined to think that these sections here in chapters 22, possibly through to the end of chapter 24, but at least chapters 22 and 23, mark some of the earlier sections in the book, perhaps quite early. The second thing I want to just kind of say quickly is that the appropriation of wisdom from or thought ideas from other texts, other foreign texts, including Egyptian texts, but we could even go further afield, depending on where we're talking about in not just Proverbs, but in Israel's corpus of authoritative texts. Even where it's brought in, it's necessarily reframed. So there might be a level of dialogue with foreign texts, but it's always recast in terms of their own ideological value system and their own theological understanding of the world, and ultimately, I would argue, within the covenant framework. So the third point is that actually I've got four things now that I'm thinking about it. Now you've got the ball rolling. So the third thing that I'll say is that wherever the kind of composition of these parts of Proverbs actually happened, and to whatever degree we kind of see a direct link with the covenantal worldview as it's expressed in Deuteronomy, I think nevertheless what we've got is a reframing that happens by the time that different collections in the book, and certainly the book as a whole, is being brought together. It lends itself really well to being recast in that light anyway. And the other thing that I was going to say is just kind of coming back to the earliness of the section that parallels Amenemope. William Schneidevant has a really interesting take on this section of Proverbs, where he notes a word or two that is quite archaic and, in his view, quite obviously seem to fall out of use, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. There are a few text critical issues that are similar, but he looks particularly at the idea of mahir, a scribe of some kind, and says, well, I mean, we see this used a few other places in the Hebrew Bible. It's very uncommon, and what we see is that the scribes just didn't quite know what it meant. They were using it as an archaism and just doing the best with what they had, which perhaps points back to a time where Israelite scribes had access to a version of the text of Amenemope. They brought it into the fold of the text that they had in circulation, but that then time went on, Amenemope got forgotten, and this text stayed in their library. So by this point, yeah, it might have had its origins kind of like cross-pollinating with Amenemope, but it didn't stay that way. It became its own thing that was just there within their library. And we now, after the fact, look at this text, look at Amenemope, and understandably see the parallels, but they just didn't think of it that way. So this is very speculative, and I'm just kind of sharing some of what I've come across and sort of where I think I might be leaning, but I haven't made my mind up yet. All this just to kind of pull all this together and tie a bow on it. I think where we see indications of foreign influence, I just want to underscore the point that it's nevertheless enfolded into and engrafted into that covenantal worldview, whatever its origins might have been, and is given a new slant as a result. I hope that helps.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you, Rachel. You can see it got Matt going, so that's what we want.
Yes.
Okay, now Neil, I hope it's a very difficult one for Matt. Oh, you're muted, Neil. You're muted, yeah.
Apologies. Thank you, Matt, for that. And again, thank you, or congratulations on completing your PhD. That's wonderful. So yeah, wisdom and law has been something I've been throwing around in the back of my mind just as far as the history of thought is concerned. Diachronically, you're placing Deuteronomy as preceding Proverbs without getting into the details. Wise regarding that. That's books could be written on that. Regarding the last question, I'm sure you probably have some things that you could add to that regarding the words of Achikar. You'd mentioned the Persian period, and that would be close-ish, 5th century. But that's not my question. So in your overall paradigm, Deuteronomy, of course, again, precedes Proverbs. Have you considered that wisdom perhaps as a precursor to law in ancient Israel's historical / cultural memory, thinking about earlier texts within the Pentateuch, and also in light of perhaps the serendipity of finds some of these materials. For example, we've got the instructions of Shurupak, which is mid 3rd millennium. The earliest law collection that we have would be the laws of Ur-Nammu, which would be around the 21st century BC. What do you think about that? Have you explored that?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's reaching into terrain that I'm going to admit that I'm less familiar with. But what I will say is that I'd want to be careful about using wisdom as a generic label, just in general. This comes partly from some of my reservations about the wisdom literature category as it's used in modern scholarship, which Will Kynes has recently argued quite strongly against. But I think we see some of the way that the conversation unfolded broadly under that umbrella, seeping into some of the ways that we often tend to talk about things. And some of the assumptions that whether or not that these are kind of dominant assumptions or not necessarily even your assumptions, but assumptions that sort of make its way into the discussion, that we've got a sort of wisdom tradition of some kind, and that is somehow set apart from a legal tradition or a kind of tradition of Torah writing scribes, or however you want to put it. I just don't think that they operated in separate domains and that they had a a grab bag for wisdom and a grab bag for law. Although, of course, I'm also not suggesting that laws and proverbs were one and the same thing and nobody could tell the difference. Obviously, there were generic differences and different domains that these might have operated in. So if we're talking about, say, the use of proverbs and those sorts of sayings under the banner of wisdom, then my reservations notwithstanding, I think, yeah, maybe that could very well be at least part of the story. That we've got commonplace understandings of how the world works, and some of this I gesture towards in the lecture, but we've got commonplace and common sense understandings of how the world works, and ways that groups organize themselves and go about organizing their lives together in community that over time become somewhat more hardened as society needs more regulation and structure. I still think we need to be careful because, well, what we've seen in recent scholarship is that the legislative paradigm that we quite often imposed on ancient Near Eastern law and including biblical law has sort of fallen away, and it's got some heavy critics now to say, well, actually, ancient Near Eastern law and biblical law operated within a non-legislative paradigm and functioned more as wisdom for those responsible for judging to kind of see that righteousness and justice is met in the cases that they're judging. So even there's a level of fluidity that I don't think we necessarily can bracket them too firmly. But nevertheless, I think at least in some cases, I think we can see something of that pipeline. One more thing that I'll add is just to say that there's been some interesting work done by some scholars. Sarah Milstein is the name that's coming to mind at the moment, of how this worked itself out in some scribal circles and some scribal practices where you've got scribal. I don't remember if she quite says scribal exercises, but you've got the sorts of texts that are kind of there present within their repertoire that then sort of informs the legal material that would make its way into say the legal text of the Pentateuch. To what degree that was going on, I'm actually quite happy to leave up in the air, but I do find it interesting to think through just how that pipeline might have worked its way out. Thus ends my ramblings, and I don't know if any of that was useful, but those are just some of my thoughts off the cuff.
Yeah, no, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Neil. Great question.
And
Okay.
one that I think I want to do more work on. So, I mean, I appreciate you asking it. I feel like this is more your area of expertise than mine, but I appreciate your opportunity, you giving me the opportunity to speak to it anyway.
Okay. David Stark has got his hand up.
Thanks, Matt. It's really good. It makes a lot of sense. I love the framework that you've got. I have a question about an edge case, and in particular with the fourth commandment. So two parts here. One, am I right that as I was tracking along with the lecture, that was the only one of the 10 that you didn't mention? And then part two is, I guess, what would you say to us about the connection of the fourth commandment to Proverbs, if part A is correct, particularly in view of like the twice told proverb about not sleeping, not slumbering, and not folding your hands to rest?
Yeah, thanks. It's one of two commands that I don't see very clearly in Proverbs. The other is the image command, making images. Now, if you group that with the first command, depending on how you number the Decalogue, perhaps that's a moot point. But regardless, well picked up on the Sabbath. I don't see that clearly referred to in Proverbs. Although our very own Craig Bartholomew has pointed out in his work on the Decalogue in Proverbs that the command points both to rest, but also to work. rest on the Sabbath, but also work days 1 to 6. And Proverbs doesn't really mandate resting on the Sabbath, just it's not one of the things that it speaks to. But it does speak very clearly to what the nature of work on days 1 to 6 should look like. And I think gives a pretty robust picture that doesn't have to exclude rest, but it does kind of point to now when you are working, do so diligently, because if you're going to slack off, it's not going to go well for you.
Yeah, and Matt, so David, great question. I mean, I really could, if I could come in on that, as you were talking, it suddenly struck me that, I mean, if you take that line, that, and I mean, I think the fourth commandment is about, 6 days you will labor, and so it's a commandment about work and rest. And there's a certain sense in which Proverbs 31, if we take it as the climax of the book of Proverbs, is a chapter about work.
Yeah. And a kind of really strong foregrounding of sorry, my family just walked in. A really strong foregrounding of the values that are promoted through the book of Proverbs, kind of given supreme expression in a woman that in so many ways evokes woman wisdom herself. And I think deliberately so. That I just think it dovetails, well, it kind of draws together so many of these key ideas in Proverbs, and yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we have about 20 minutes. So I just want to ask Matt two questions, and then I will bring Nigel in and anyone else. So, I think those who haven't worked in academic Old Testament studies, I think will miss, Matt, how radical this presentation is. So you did refer briefly to the siloing of law, prophecy, and wisdom. And so when I was doing Old Testament studies at Oxford, for example, one was simply taught that these were separate categories, and if there was common vocabulary, they had nothing to do with each other. Okay, so I wonder if you could just very briefly, I mean, your work is part of a paradigm shift, which is a retrieval of the fact that the Decalogue really undergirds and informs the worldview of Proverbs. And if you could just help us briefly to see how radical that is. And then the second question, which may be a more naughty question, but that's for you to decide, is I'm really intrigued that you've referred continually to Deuteronomy, but the primary version canonically of the Decalogue is Exodus 20. And I'm wondering why are you referring continually back to Deuteronomy rather than to what is canonically the primary version?
Good. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm glad you asked that second question because it did occur to me as well that well, let me put it this way. The reason I think is because that's the version that Proverbs calls to mind. We see this first of all just in the fact that when you look at the language that Proverbs uses, particularly in chapters 1 to 9 and in chapter 30, it's soaked in the language of Deuteronomy and the covenant expression, or the expression of the covenant that's set forth in Deuteronomy. And second, what we find is that there are some subtler clues that point to when it comes to the Decalogue, it's got that version in mind too. Now, which version, in some sense, doesn't matter because, well, the authors of Proverbs would have taken Exodus and its version of the Decalogue to be as authoritative. In some sense, it's neither here nor there. But in, say, Ager's words, when he uses, let me just pull this up quickly. When Ager refers to the Decalogue, he uses the words of Deuteronomy. Sorry, let me just find it quickly. When he, in his prayer, in verses 7 to 9, give me neither too much nor too little, lest I... Sorry, I'm doing a bad job of finding it. When he talks about deceit and lying speech, the Hebrew word that he uses there, shav, is the word that's used in Deuteronomy's version of the Decalogue. Exodus uses a different word. Now it's a synonym. It's pointing at the same thing. It's the same idea that's being called to mind. But it is interesting that the language that's used is, well, Deuteronomy's version. To the first point, to the first question, just to kind of situate this whole thing in where a lot of scholarship has been. Michael Fox was mentioned earlier. I think he's a good example here, who's written perhaps the best two-volume commentary on the book of Proverbs. But his view is that a book like Proverbs and a book like Deuteronomy have very little to do with each other. That when Proverbs echoes so much of the language of Deuteronomy in chapters 1 to 9, that a lot of that is put down to coincidence. That it's just scribal rhetorical flourishes, or just common language that was common enough in their circle, in the direction of seeing Proverbs take on the same covenantal significance as Deuteronomy. This has been the dominant paradigm for a time's time and half a time. Going back into the 20th century, what we see that there's a very strong emphasis, particularly in the earlier part of the 20th century when Achikar and Amenemope were discovered. There's this very strong emphasis on the international flavor of Proverbs and very little interest in how Proverbs actually draws from its own literature, from Israel's own literature and its own covenantal paradigms. As the 20th century would progress, we've got statements like wisdom is an orphan in the world of the Old Testament, and that it operates resolutely within a theology of creation, the subtext being not covenant. Those two shouldn't be held apart anyway, in my view, but that was the dominant paradigm, that it's creation and not covenant. It's natural revelation, not special revelation. Musings on life and how the world works in general, not the particular relationship between God and the people of Israel. And it's a tide that has begun to turn in recent years. So I'm joining a wave rather than starting one. But it's been a very welcome wave in my view, and one that very strongly kind of points in the direction of like why would we see these as operating separately? That we've got the law and the prophets operating in one corner and the sages with their ideas about wisdom operating in another. It seems silly. But there's a lot of work that needs to go into undoing some of the patterns of thought and the paradigms that people have been thinking in. Some of them I've mentioned already. Wisdom literature as a category, I find unhelpful for that reason. And Will Kynes has written the authoritative work opening that discussion. The idea of a wisdom tradition or a separate class of sages within Israelite scribal circles, I think has some unhelpful, even if it's not kind of adopted wholesale, just kind of operating still with those assumptions, I think is unhelpful for the way that we think about the worldview of the people of Israel and Judah.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. So, and I hope all of you heard that. Every now and again in biblical studies, things develop that are of enormous consequence. And this retrieval of the very strong connection between Torah and wisdom is one of those moments. And Matt and his wife are both surfers, and so I was glad to hear him use the metaphor of catching the wave. And I think that's what he's done very effectively. But Matt, so I started off by just saying that we have such a desperate need for wisdom in the world at the moment. I mean, we have a need for the wisdom in diplomacy. We have a need for wisdom in the relationship between nations. We have a wisdom to know what to do in this world turned upside down. Now you have been immersed, of course, in the academic side of Proverbs, and that's what one expects from a doctoral student. But do you have any sense of why a retrieval of wisdom in this new paradigm might be so critical for us today?
Yes. It's striking to me that somebody like Solomon in the Book of Kings is paraded as Israel's paradigm of wisdom. Yet, at least as the narrative of Kings tells the story, Solomon was incredibly wise when it came to fashioning a kingdom that was impressive and a kingdom that checked all the boxes by ancient Near Eastern standards. And yet, at key junctures throughout the narrative, right from early on, there are red flags and warning signs that Solomon's wisdom isn't quite in alignment with what we find in the Torah. And at the end, it cost him. At the end, it cost the kingdom of Israel. And I think what the narrative shows us is that you can be wise without reference to God. And it can look very impressive. And you can get very far in your dealings with people, in the kingdoms that you're able to fashion, in the success that you're able to accrue. But ultimately, there's a wisdom that God calls for that is quite different to the way that the world works. And I think we've got very good reason to pay attention to that wisdom, because that's the wisdom that ultimately is going to lead to prolonged days. That's the wisdom that's going to lead to life. That's going to lead to abundance and not of the world's sort and within the world's value system, but an abundance that comes from joy in God and from listening to Him and being attentive to what He has to say. And I think that's what our world needs in so many ways. Another thing that I'd say just on the nature and the need for wisdom, and particularly bring it back to the Decalogue, we continue to hold the Decalogue as a supreme expression of God's wisdom and of God's expectations for God's people. But to figure out how that looks in different areas of life, what that looks like for how we mete out all the different commands, how we think about the God's expectations impinging on our present moments and our own sets of complexities and difficult situations and questions and crises and concerns and all the different things that life may throw our way. Building a life that is oriented toward the fear of the Lord, and a life that is grounded on the instruction of God that shows forth in those decisions requires wisdom. And requires a wisdom that is both there in mental acuity and ability to interpret God's word well and to understand kind of what is being said and how that's then going to impinge on us, but also in other ways as well. It's got an intrinsic moral side to it that wisdom isn't something that's just thought. It's something that becomes so ingrained in us that we can do the right thing automatically, or with a level of automaticity that comes from so internalizing and so being attentive to God's word and what God has to say to us.